Hi there! Today I would like to talk about an interesting topic in data management, which is data rules. My name is Treder and I'm looking forward to talking to you about this interesting topic today. Let's have a look at an interesting example from real life experience. A group of people told the data folks they intend to take master data as a mass copy from the single source of truth and maintain it locally. Oh, you would say, you should never do that, right? And that's what the data folks said. Don't do that. It is going to create two different sources of truth which are not consistent, and integrity of data would be lost. How did the project react? It says, well, it's easiest for us, so who would stop us? And the data folks had to admit that, except for their good content arguments, they didn't have any weapon, anything to stop a project from going the wrong way. And that leads me to the question of data rules. Would rules help? And if so, how would they help? First of all, you would think of rules as something from the last century that is strict and that doesn't fit into the times of data democratization and things, right? So this is what you hear from people. We are no longer requiring rules. Everybody takes data into their own hands. If we have centralized rules, it will slow down all the projects because they have to follow and adhere and consider, and that's not really what we want to do. And we are no longer flexible. Without rules we can do what we want. Rules just limit our freedom. And finally, don't give us rules, we know what we are doing. You may have heard that from different areas. But why should we then want to introduce rules if we see resistance across the board? One way of looking at it, and you can even communicate that, is if you are on the right side, if you're trying to do the right things, you wouldn't have to be afraid of rules. You would rather welcome the rules because they would protect you from those on the wrong side, on those who do not handle data properly and who might require rules to prevent them from doing the wrong thing. And in fact, there are really, really good fact-based rules for data rules. First of all, data quality. If you have a record that says the value is 5, do you know from the 5 whether it's a good or a bad 5, whether it's correct or not? No, you can't tell from the content whether data is good. That is why you need to govern the creation and the maintenance of data, and that can only happen through rules. Guidance, right? Some people would love to do the right things, but they don't know what to do. And the rules help them understand what to do in which situation. Future-proof solutions are an important aspect as well. People tend to shoot from the hip, to implement quick wins and focus on their own project only. They'd have to take a long-term perspective to find sustainable solutions, and that's what data rules try to enforce. Trustworthy results. If you want data to be turned into something that tells you the truth, you'd have to use rules to use the data properly. Regulatory compliance, this is an ugly thing, right? But you have a lot of industries that have to follow laws and in external regulation, and in order to do so, and in order to prove that they are compliant, they have to establish and follow data rules. Finally, you all know of human bias as one of the most critical aspects of data management. And even those who don't want to behave improperly often fall prey to human bias. Data rules, if built well, can help eliminate bias. So, what is another argument against rules? You would think we don't need them, right? Because data is something that happens automatically. But compare it to the other areas of your company. Look at your production, and this is from a chemical company. This is governed end to end, and no single step happens without proper rules. The same with the money flow, from incoming payment from customers to your own payment of suppliers and taxes and everything. Everything has to follow rules. The supply chain, buying goods that you need to produce your own goods, bringing those from one warehouse to the other and bringing it eventually to the customers. All of that is very complicated and would not work if you didn't have a properly managed supply chain based on rules. So, if that's all a matter of course, why should we just have one of the most critical elements of running a business exempted from being subject to rules? That is an interesting question that may help people reflect about the need for rules. Can an organization survive without rules? Right, and now question yourself. You are doing something now and you see problems. And you think, oh, there was this data behavior in the past. If they had treated data properly, we wouldn't be in this bad situation right now. And if only we could hold them accountable. And then, shortly after, you find yourself in a situation where you say, oh, in order to deliver the project on time, in order to avoid hiccup with software that you don't know, for whatever reason, you move the data trouble into the future. And those will have exactly the same thoughts about you that you are having about your predecessors many, many years ago. So this is really making clear that rules do not necessarily benefit those who apply them immediately. Rules are meant to enforce long-term thinking, because people don't do that voluntarily. What it is not about, rules can be misused, of course, a weapon against those who think differently. And remember, data rules are not carved in stone. They can change because the situation can change, and they have to be designed in a way that they can be modified. The ego of a data manager is one of the most underestimated obstacles if you think of the success of data in a company. And it is absolutely important that rules cannot be used to support such a selfish approach. Finally, adhering to the rules is not an end in itself. It always has to serve a purpose. It is an endeavor without risks. Most people have not been waiting for those rules to come, right? And they either don't understand it, or they consider it a spanner in the works, or they just claim that they don't make sense. So you have to react to those behaviors, even if you're not aware of them, because those behaviors are there in the workforce, whether you want it or not. So it's a good approach to use business language so that people understand the rules. You would try all you can to avoid bureaucracy. Bureaucracy doesn't happen if you try to be bureaucratic. It happens if you don't try not to be bureaucratic. And finally, explain the purpose of the rules. People do not only need to know how the rules work, they need to know why. Let's have a look at few aspects of data rules. Things that you may wish to think of when implementing data rules. First of all, rules are not a machine. You have to deal with emotions. And imagine people that have to work with each other are at risk of getting into conflict. And disagreement is, of course, the key source of conflict. If you have rules, you can mitigate that part. And there are two aspects of how data rules can reduce friction here. First of all, through the reduction of available choices. If there are 3 ways of doing it, everybody would pick one way of doing it and they would argue over what's the best way. If there is only one way, what do people want to argue about? And the other is through reduction of interpretation options. If it is stated clearly, how would you want to discuss about how it's meant? You have one statement and one way of understanding it, and that removes further potential conflict. So keep this in mind. When dealing with data rules, clarity beats perfection. Another aspect is the approval process. It is not sufficient to have the rules, they have to be applied, and then you have to go through a process where somebody checks what somebody else proposed. And now let's have a look at a couple of typical purposes of an approval process that I have seen in companies. First of all, we want somebody to approve so that if it fails, that person is going to harvest all the blame. Second option, our internal standards ask for it, right? We don't know what it is used for. We don't know what would happen if we didn't do it, but we do it because there is a standard. Terrible. We need to look good in case of an audit. So you can demonstrate that you've had this perfect approval process which was mandated. But if you didn't have it, you would succeed anyway, so no value for you. Is that good enough? We need to make use of our great workflow tool. A typical aspect of an IT-driven organization. You have the solution before you know the problem. And once you have a workflow tool, you feel urged to use it. Not really a good argument, isn't it? It looks more professional. Yes, true, it really does. But what's the good in it if it doesn't help? Some may admit that they just don't have any approval processes. That's the easiest answer. Can you think of another reason, one that actually makes sense, that justifies approval processes? Of course you can. You want to have approval processes in place so that people can check what other people intend to do, check them against the rules and say, is the direction right or not, and stop it if it is not, or make people change direction to be in line with the rules, because those rules make sense. Documentation is something that people really don't like, right? But it is so essential. You have to document all of your rules. Don't rely on, the fact that everybody has heard them or you hope they have heard them. You need to do that digitally, of course. That means proper document management system, searchable, cross-reference, audit trail, all the things that are possible with modern technology should be applied here. Accessible. People need to have access to all rules. They need to know where to find them. They need to be able to read them and to find what they need whenever they are in a situation of taking decisions. Well structured. Build it in a way that it makes sense, that you have a logical setup that people understand. And finally, ensure your rules are binding. They are not loose recommendations. They are something that people have to follow. And across all of these, do not only document the rules themselves. Document the purpose of the rules. Where has it come from? What has gone wrong before we had that rule, and so on. And make that part of your documentation. If it's part of the project documentation, it will be gone with the project. If it's part of the documentation of the rules. It will stay as long as the rules stay. When are your rules done? As soon as everybody agrees so that we have a common understanding, here we are? Or as soon as everything is covered by your rules? Or maybe even as soon as each rule has been applied at least once and you know that they work? No, rules might turn out to be wrong. You have done all you could to validate, but eventually you found out that it's not the right rule. They might be missteering. They might foster wrong behavior because maybe they are incomplete and they only focus on one part of the story and the other part remains ungoverned. That needs to be found out through permanent observation. And even if the rules are perfect, the environment might change. And what was a good rule yesterday might be an inadequate rule tomorrow. So ensure that you foresee regular reviews of all of your data rules. What can data rules look like? There's not one single way of doing it. And what I'm going to tell you now is not a recipe that you should blindly follow. It's just a couple of ideas that you may pick from, because data rules have to match your company. They have to match the way your organization works, your culture, and must resonate with the employees. We have tried a 3-element model. That 3-element model consists of the Constitution, the law, and the court decisions. And it's for good reason that this model resembles a state organization, because that is what you know from states. You have the Constitution that is short, easily understandable, and known to everybody. You have the law that is very complex, known to a few only, but the rest gets it from a principal perspective. And then you have the court decisions, those that take decisions in a single case based on law and constitution. So let's start with the Constitution. We have set up a constitution called Data Principles. And those data principles focus on a couple of things. First of all, everybody needs to get it. It is the foundation for data literacy. If you bombard people with terminology of data management and all this complex vocabulary, they won't get it. If there's a limited list of easily understandable principles, or at least things that you can explain when you bring them up, people will get it. Keep it. It's not sufficient that people understand it. They have to remember it. They have to see it later and say, oh, I remember that is part of the data principles. Thirdly, use it. It's not just to look good as a poster on the wall. People need to be able to apply those principles and translate them in their concrete cases to clear action. Finally, share it. Data principles should be shared by everybody, should be co-owned by everybody. So the best thing is to already start involving people when you develop your data principles in the first place. And develop means adjust your principles to your specific company, because data principles are always company specific. There is no standard set that works everywhere. So what do those principles look like? I'm just showing one example. Yours will probably look different. Focus on business benefits. Adhere to data strategy. It sounds like a matter of course. It is not. Data is cross-functional and global. It is not owned by single companies. It requires ownership, business ownership, not IT ownership. There can only be one single source of truth, one logical, not necessarily physical, single source of truth. You have to cover all data. No data is excluded from proper data handling. you need one common language so that people understand each other. Data needs to fit together. Data from different departments need to be able to work together to derive meaning across departmental borders. Sustainable data quality. Data quality would be achieved through fixing it once. Sustainable data quality is achieved by setting up something that keeps data clean. And finally, standardize. If everybody has work based on the same standards, they don't have to align before they work together because they are already on the same basis. Let's have a look at the second aspect, the law, the data standards. Remember, the data principles were just the constitution, but the data standards are binding and may very well go into detail. Right? And again, those might look different organization by organization, but a couple of things you would find everywhere. They need to be unambiguous. So you have to formulate them carefully so that no two ways of interpreting them are possible. Add why, add the explanations, add what you mean so that people are not irritated by a short way of formulating a data standard. And please add examples. A data standard that comes with an example is understood 5 times better than one that comes without. Document it. If there is no documentation structure in your company, you would of course have to develop one. But most companies have a way of documenting their guidelines, rules, standard operating procedures, and you name it. Use that framework and it will give you additional authority for your standards. Accessible. Yeah, those have to be accessible ideally via your intranet or other channels, but you also have to push them to the people. Don't wait for people to search for them. Make them available to people proactively, including any changes. And finally, data standards need to be measurable. What's good for data standard if you cannot tell to which extent somebody has adhered to it in a concrete situation? So make it measurable, make it clear whether a process or a way of working adheres to a standard or not, so that, again, you remove ambiguity. What belongs into your data standards? What would you want to cover here? Again, there may be different outcomes per company, but if it could be important, that's sufficient to add it. Is it too critical to be a mere recommendation, so that it is not just a principle, but it's something that has to be adhered to in 100% of all cases? Add it to your data standards. Do you think it's an obvious need and everybody will understand and know? It doesn't matter. People may be tempted not to follow something even if they understand that it's a logical way of doing it. If it's a data standard, they will be forced to follow. And finally, does everybody know it? Even if everybody knows it, they might not follow unless they are documented. The court decisions. This is the third area. That means applying the law specifically to projects. And everybody knows that projects try to take shortcuts. And that has to be governed through rules. You should be with a project throughout their lifetime, from the very first idea until the time where a project has to justify its business case in real life, because at every step within a project something could go wrong in terms of data. You might face a situation where you would have to allow deviations, where it's simply impossible to deliver a fully compliant solution on time. Maybe you even have external laws that have to be followed or adhered to quickly. In that case, document those deviations. Set up a mechanism to follow up with deviations, give them a deadline, and work against those deadlines to resolve those deviations. The general message to all projects would have to be, it is better for you to align early, because if you have to change very late in the project, it might be very costly. If you align early, we can advise you on how to handle your topics in a compliant way. So a typical sequence of steps in projects. Be with the project when they have their initial ideas. Already bring in options of how to use data to handle or solve the problems. And at that point, you would already exclude the first options that you would not accept, because there's no point investing energy in options that are not compliant with your data standards. And that would help you shape direction. If you do that for across all projects, you would develop a culture where projects directly go in the right direction. The second important milestone is project approval, where the project wants to get the money and the resources. And that project then comes with a concept. And that concept rather comes with a compliant data design. And here you would have to select and approve the final concept and make that part of the project mandate. Any other way of doing it should not be covered by the project mandate. The third step is right before a project goes into implementation. You would have an architecture review and then check the design, the final design, against the approval that was part of the project mandate. And don't wait until implementation has started, because then going back can be very costly. Finally, once the project is done, you'd rather check again whether the project has implemented as specified and approved. And you should not feel tempted to accept non-compliance here, even if millions had been invested, because that would be a fatal signal to other projects to come. Finally, a balanced approach between the two extremes, police or service provider. You all understand the police character of rules. Somebody who says, follow the rules or you go to jail. But there is a service provider aspect to it as well. And, if you set up rules and you focus on the police aspect, you would look bad. So stress the positive side of rules. If you have a service provider function only, but there wasn't be a police aspect, it wouldn't really help the organization, because it would come down to you doing unbinding recommendations. So, like with traffic, speed limits are a constraint, but people understand the benefits. With that, I would say thanks for listening, and feel free to read further in one of my 2 books. Thank you.